Black maids don't read contracts. The sentence sliced through the boardroom so cleanly that even the air seemed to stop moving. 12 investors turned their heads at once. Some blinked. Some smiled awkwardly. Others lowered their eyes to avoid being part of what had just happened. At the far end of the 40-foot walnut table, Richard Whitmore adjusted the silver cuff on his tailored sleeve as if he had merely stated the weather. The morning skyline of Manhattan glowed behind him through floor-to-ceiling glass, cold blue light spilling across polished stone floors and crystal water glasses. Grace Bennett stood near the side wall holding a silver tray with untouched coffee cups balanced in steady hands. Her black housekeeping uniform was pressed neatly, her name tag small and plain against the dark fabric. She had been invisible all morning, the way staff were expected to be in rooms like this. Invisible until now. Richard picked up the contract folder and let it slide across the table with 2 fingers. It stopped inches from Grace's shoes. What they do, he continued, voice smooth as marble, is clean up after people who do. A few nervous laughs escaped. One investor coughed into his fist. Another stared hard at the city below as if the skyline had suddenly become fascinating. Charles Harrington, founder of Harrington Capital, sat at the head of the table with a Mont Blanc pen poised above the final signature page. He did not laugh. He simply watched. Grace bent calmly, lifted the folder, and placed it back on the table without a sound. Her face gave nothing away. No anger. No embarrassment. No plea for dignity. Just stillness. Richard noticed it and seemed irritated by her calm. Men like him preferred visible discomfort. "We're in the middle of a $900 million acquisition," he said, glancing around the room. "Let's keep distractions to a minimum." The investors nodded because nodding was easy. Outside, a helicopter crossed the Hudson like a small dark insect. Inside, the room smelled faintly of leather chairs, expensive cologne, and burnt espresso. Grace turned to leave. Then her eyes caught a line on the open page Richard had left exposed. One sentence. 17 words. Her steps slowed. The tray in her hands did not shake, but something sharper than surprise moved behind her eyes. She knew that clause. She knew the rhythm of its language, the placement of every comma, the protective wall it was meant to build. But this version had been altered. Quietly. Precisely. Dangerously. Richard was still speaking, outlining projected returns, tax efficiencies, cross-border leverage. His voice rolled confidently through the room, while numbers glowed on the wall monitor behind him. Grace read the page again from 6 feet away. The liability shield had been reversed. If signed, losses would flow downstream into pension funds tied to municipal workers and retirees. Thousands of people who would never know this room existed could pay for one elegant lie. Charles lowered his pen to the paper. "Any final concerns?" he asked. Richard smiled. "None worth delaying success." Grace inhaled once. The ventilation hummed overhead. Somewhere down the hall, an elevator bell chimed. She stepped forward and set the tray gently on the credenza. Porcelain touched wood with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. "Sir," she said. Her voice was low, clear, and carried farther than anyone expected. Charles looked up first. Richard turned slowly, annoyance already rising in his expression. "Don't sign clause 17. Silence fell so completely that the city itself seemed distant. A woman near the center of the table stopped typing mid-word. One investor removed his glasses. Richard gave a short laugh, meant to restore control. "Excuse me." Grace met Charles Harrington's eyes, not Richard's. "That clause was changed. It moves liability from the seller to the retirement trust attached to this fund." Charles straightened in his chair. Richard leaned back, smiling now with sharpened patience. "And how?" he asked, each word polished and cold. "Would housekeeping know that?" Grace looked at the page, then back at him. "Because the original language protected the workers." Richard spread his hands theatrically. "Then by all means," he said, drawing amused glances from 2 men beside him. "Read it to us." Grace stepped to the table. Morning light touched the edge of her cheekbone. She did not reach for the paper. She didn't need to. "Section 4, paragraph B," she said. "In the event of post-closing claims, responsibility remains solely with the transferring entity." Her eyes shifted to the altered page. "But you replaced solely with proportionally and transferring entity with affiliated trust participants." The smiles disappeared one by one. Charles looked down sharply. Richard's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Grace's hands rested at her sides, empty now, steady as stone. That means if this deal collapses, she said softly, janitors, bus drivers, teachers, and retirees absorb the loss. No one moved. Charles slowly closed the pen in his hand. Richard stared at Grace for a long second, then said the only thing pride could still reach for. Who exactly do you think you are? Grace answered without raising her voice. The woman who wrote the first draft. The room did not erupt. It tightened. That was worse. Sound vanished first, then movement, then the confidence Richard Whitmore had worn like an expensive coat all morning. Charles Harrington kept his eyes on Grace for a long moment, measuring not her uniform, not her badge, but the steadiness in her voice. Then he slid the contract toward himself and turned to page 17. Paper whispered across the polished table. Around him, investors leaned forward in careful silence, drawn by instinct to the scent of danger. Richard gave a short laugh that landed nowhere. This is absurd, he said. She memorized a few phrases and thinks she understands corporate law. Grace did not answer. She simply stood beside the table with her hands relaxed at her sides, the same hands that had polished glass doors before sunrise and stacked cups no one remembered using. Charles read line by line. His silver brows lowered. The pulse in his jaw shifted once. He reached for the second binder beside him. The archived draft said his legal office had circulated 3 weeks earlier. Bring me version 1, he said. No one moved at first because no one was sure whom he meant. Then his assistant nearly rose out of her chair and hurried to the credenza. Cabinet. Richard straightened. Charles, we do not need to indulge this interruption. Bring it. Charles repeated, still reading. Outside the windows, low winter lights spread across the Hudson in pale bands of steel. Inside, every small sound grew sharp. Ice settled in a water glass. A chair creaked. Someone cleared his throat and regretted it instantly. The assistant returned with a blue folder and placed it in front of Charles. He opened both versions side by side. His finger traced one paragraph, then the other. He looked up slowly. Who approved these edits? Richard's answer came too fast. Routine revisions. Risk balancing language. Standard cleanup. Cleanup, Charles repeated, the word flat and dangerous. Grace lowered her eyes for the first time, not from fear, but from memory. 3 years earlier, she had sat in a cramped legal research office in Newark with a space heater rattling under the desk and written the original protective clause after midnight. She had written it while checking hospital messages from her mother between drafts. She had written it because pension funds were often the first people sacrificed and the last people informed. She had written it under a contractor number because no one in that firm wanted a junior black woman's name on final documents sent uptown. Richard turned toward Grace with a smile sharpened by embarrassment. You expect anyone here to believe you drafted a $900 million acquisition contract while wearing housekeeping shoes? A few faces winced. Even those who had laughed earlier now recognized the smell of a man sinking deeper by choice. Grace met him calmly. No, she said. I expect them to believe the files. Charles looked to his assistant. Pull authorship metadata. Richard's head snapped toward him. That is unnecessary. Do it. The assistant opened her laptop with trembling fingers and connected to the wall screen. A corporate logo vanished. File properties replaced it. Created by. Last edited by. Revision history. Names appeared in black text against a white field brighter than the room deserved. Initial author, G. Bennett. Consultant ID 4471. Subsequent revisions, R. Whitmore. A. Breath moved through the room like wind under a door. One investor removed his glasses and cleaned lenses that were not dirty. Another leaned back and folded both hands over his stomach, suddenly unwilling to touch anything. Richard stared at the screen as if outrage might erase it. That proves nothing, he said. Support staff upload files all the time. Grace spoke before Charles could. Open the comments thread on draft 1. The assistant clicked. Yellow side notes filled the margin. Suggested protections for municipal retirement accounts. Exposure cap recommendations. Cross-reference corrections. Every note signed GB. Charles read them one by one. The room watched his face instead of the screen now. Richard's voice lost polish. Charles, listen to me. She was clerical support. We refined rough material. Grace turned slightly toward the investors. I was contract labor. I billed at $70 an hour. Richard billed this room $900. No one laughed. Charles closed the folders with deliberate care. Why are you in housekeeping? He asked. It was the first gentle question anyone had offered all morning. Grace answered plainly. My mother got sick. I left consulting to care for her. After she passed, the gap on my resume became a wall. This building offered night shifts. I took them. The truth settled heavier than accusation. Richard reached for indignation because pride had nothing else left. Are we now turning a sympathy story into governance policy? Charles stood. His chair rolled back softly on the stone floor. At 6'3", he did not need to raise his voice. No, he said. We are turning fraud prevention into governance policy. He looked at the investors. This meeting is suspended. Then he looked at Richard. Do not leave the floor. Finally, he turned to Grace. The same woman everyone had ignored now stood at the center of a room built to exclude people like her. Miss Bennet, Charles said, each word measured. Please come with me. Richard swallowed hard. Grace glanced once at the silver tray she had set aside. Coffee had gone cold in every cup. Charles Harrington's private office was quieter than the boardroom, but somehow more intense. The city stretched beyond the glass walls and clean winter lines, ferries moving across the river like slow white stitches. Inside, the room smelled of cedar shelves and fresh paper. Grace Bennet stood just inside the doorway, hands folded neatly in front of her, while Charles removed his jacket and draped it over the back of a chair. He looked older now than he had at the head of the table, not weaker, just less armored. Please sit, he said. Grace remained standing for a moment, then took the chair opposite his desk. It was the same chair attorneys fought to occupy. The leather felt colder than she expected. Charles opened the blue folder again and studied the margin notes with renewed attention. You wrote all of this? He asked. Yes, sir. Alone. With coffee and deadlines. For the first time that morning, a smile almost reached his face. It faded quickly. Why did no one know your name? Grace looked toward the skyline. Because names are expensive in some rooms. Charles absorbed that in silence. Down the hall, muffled footsteps passed and disappeared. He tapped the folder once. My company paid Whitmore legal 8 figures over the last 3 years. I know. How do you know? I cleaned the conference room after billing meetings. There was no bitterness in her tone, which somehow made the truth sharper. Charles leaned back slowly. And you never said anything. No one asked. He exhaled through his nose and stared at the contract history again, seeing more than file data now. He was seeing years of assumptions stacked neatly like polished stone. Meanwhile, outside the office, the 29th floor had become a building full of whispers. Assistants paused at printers. Analysts refreshed internal chat threads every few seconds. Security stood straighter than usual. Richard Whitmore sat alone in a glass conference room at the end of the corridor, his phone face down on the table because no one was returning his calls quickly enough. He could still see the look on the investors' faces when the metadata appeared. He hated that look. Not disgust. Worse, disappointment. He rose and paced 10 measured steps, then 10 back. Through the glass wall he watched staff pass by without meeting his eyes. Men like Richard lived on reflected certainty. Once people stopped reflecting it, the room changed temperature. Back in Charles's office, Grace noticed a framed photograph on the credenza. Charles younger, standing beside sanitation workers in orange jackets at the opening of a pension-backed infrastructure project. My father drove buses, Charles said suddenly, following her gaze. 32 years in Queens. Grace turned back to him. Then he would have understood Clause 17. Charles nodded once, slowly. He would have. A soft knock interrupted them. His assistant entered carrying a slim tablet and a printed memo. Sir, compliance has begun review. Also, 3 investors request a statement before market open. Charles scanned the memo, then looked up. Tell them the company identified a governance issue before execution. Tell them no funds moved. Tell them I will address them personally in 1 hour. She hesitated, glancing toward Grace with a mixture of curiosity and respect. And Mr. Whitmore? Charles's face cooled. He can wait. When the door closed, Grace lowered her eyes. Sir, I did not speak up for recognition. I know. I spoke up because those pensions matter. I know that too. Charles stood and walked to the window. 40 stories below, yellow cabs moved like toy cars through avenues of light. Do you know what scares me most, Miss Bennet? He asked. That he changed one paragraph? No, he turned. That everyone in that room believed him before they heard you. Grace said nothing because there was nothing false in it. Charles returned to his desk and opened another file. This one thinner, older, marked vendor contractors. Her name sat near the middle. Contract ended 18 months ago. No renewal. Performance notes, exceptional. He frowned. Why were you not rehired? Grace answered plainly. The partner overseeing outside consultants said clients preferred a different look. The room became very still. Charles did not ask who the partner was. He already knew. Richard Whitmore had chaired contractor review that year. Charles closed the file with controlled care. I built this firm telling myself merit rises. Grace met his eyes. Sometimes it does. Sometimes someone places a hand on it. Another silence passed, but this one felt less heavy than the others. More honest. Charles pressed the intercom. Megan, bring human resources and general counsel to my office. Now. He released the button and looked at Grace. What do you want? She seemed surprised by the question. Excuse me. Not what you need. What do you want? Grace considered it longer than ambition usually allows. A fair chance to do the work I trained to do. Charles nodded. Reasonable. He reached for a blank legal pad and uncapped a fountain pen. Then help me understand every weakness in that acquisition package before 10 o'clock. Grace blinked. You are asking me to review the deal? I am asking the person who already saved it. Outside, clouds shifted and sunlight entered the office in a broad pale band, warming the edge of the desk. Grace looked at the pad, then at the man across from her. For years, doors had been closed quietly, politely, efficiently. This one was opening the same way. She moved her chair closer to the desk. In the glass room down the hall, Richard saw her through the corridor window, seated beside Charles Harrington, both leaning over documents. For the first time that morning, Richard Whitmore understood he was no longer inside the room that mattered. By 9:15, Charles Harrington's office no longer felt like a private room. It felt like the center of a storm. The general counsel arrived first, carrying 2 binders and the expression of a man who had been summoned before coffee finished working. Human resources followed with tablets, notepads, and careful faces. Grace Bennett remained seated at the side of Charles's desk, no longer in the posture of a guest, but not yet fully part of the machinery either. In front of her lay the acquisition packet, opened wide, pages marked in neat red notes written with Charles's fountain pen. She had already identified 3 hidden fee escalators, 2 indemnity conflicts, and a debt rollover trigger buried in the appendix. Charles read each note in silence, then slid the next section toward her. Page 84, she said quietly. The Environmental Reserve estimate assumes numbers from 18 months ago. Updated liabilities would cut projected returns by at least 11%. The general counsel blinked. How did you spot that so quickly? Grace did not look up. The decimal alignment changed between schedules. Someone copied older tables. He checked the page, then slowly removed his glasses. She is right. Charles said nothing, but his jaw tightened once more. Outside the office, staff gathered information the way cities gather weather. Richard Whitmore had been escorted, politely but firmly, from the glass conference room to a smaller waiting suite with no skyline view. He demanded to speak with Charles. He demanded to speak with investors. He demanded to speak with anyone still impressed by titles. No one came quickly. His messages grew shorter, then sharper, then strangely friendly. Down the hall, assistants who had once rushed to greet him now walked past his door with professional blindness. Inside the office, human resources asked Grace routine questions in voices too careful to be natural. How long have you worked overnight operations? 18 months. Any disciplinary notes? No. Any prior legal disclosures regarding your consulting work? No one asked. The woman from Human Resources lowered her pen for a second. Charles spoke before the silence deepened. That ends today. He turned to Grace. How much were you paid per hour for housekeeping? $22.50. The room became uncomfortable in a new direction. Charles asked the general counsel, what did Whitmore Legal bill us last quarter? $3.4 million. No one wrote anything for several seconds. Grace continued reviewing pages as if numbers had long ago stopped surprising her. Schedule D, she said. There is a cross-default clause tied to unrelated debt. If one regional asset misses covenants, the entire structure can be repriced. The general counsel flipped pages, scanned, then looked at Charles with visible concern. We would have missed that under time pressure. Charles answered without taking his eyes off Grace. We did miss it under time pressure. The winter sun climbed higher, brightening the glass wall until reflections of everyone in the room hovered faintly over the city beyond. Grace could see herself there. Housekeeping uniform, practical shoes, borrowed authority. Yet each time she spoke, executives wrote notes. It felt unfamiliar and strangely ordinary at once, as if respect had always belonged here but been misfiled. Charles's assistant entered again. Sir, the investors are assembled in conference 1. They want reassurance. Charles checked the clock. 10 minutes. She hesitated. And Mr. Whitmore says he can explain everything. Charles looked almost tired. He has had years to explain everything. When she left, Grace closed the packet. The deal can be saved, she said. But not today. Charles nodded. What would you do? It was the second time he had asked for her judgment, and the room noticed. Grace answered carefully. Delay 48 hours. Demand fresh disclosures. Replace outside counsel. Renegotiate from leverage, not embarrassment. The general counsel gave a reluctant half-smile. I was going to say something similar. Grace met his glance politely. Then say it louder next time. A small laugh escaped Charles before he could stop it. Even human resources smiled into their notes. Then the door opened without invitation. Richard Whitmore entered in a charcoal suit that still looked expensive and suddenly poorly chosen. Charles, this has gone far enough. Security moved behind him, but Charles raised one hand. Richard's eyes landed on Grace seated beside the desk, red-marked papers in front of her. The sight hit him harder than any accusation. You put her in here, he asked. I put competence in here, Charles replied. Richard ignored the answer. She was support staff. She handled drafts. Everyone knows how this works. Grace looked at him calmly. Yes, she said. Everyone does now. He flushed. You are turning a misunderstanding into spectacle. Charles stood. No, Richard. You turned prejudice into operating procedure. We are simply reading the minutes. Richard tried one final pivot toward charm. Let me fix this. I can calm the investors. Charles's voice cooled to winter steel. The investors are calmer than I am. He stepped closer to the door. Your firm is suspended pending review. Effective immediately. Richard's mouth opened, then closed. Titles, billing rates, private club confidence. All the tools that had carried him through rooms like these found nothing to grip. He looked once more at Grace, perhaps expecting triumph on her face. There was none, only focus. She had already reopened the packet to page 112. Security waited in silence. Richard straightened what dignity he could still arrange and walked out. The door closed softly behind him. Charles turned back to the room. Conference 1, he said. Then he looked at Grace. Miss Bennett, bring your notes. She rose slowly, fountain pen in hand. 40 floors above Manhattan, the maid who had entered carrying coffee was now heading into a room full of investors carrying the future of the deal. Conference 1 was larger than the boardroom and colder in a different way. This room was built for reassurance. Soft gray walls, wide screens, quiet carpeting that swallowed footsteps. A long oval table sat beneath suspended lights that made everyone look more composed than they felt. 12 investors were already seated when Charles Harrington entered, followed by general counsel, 2 analysts, and Grace Bennett carrying a legal pad marked in red ink. Heads turned immediately. Some recognized her from the morning humiliation. Others recognized something more dangerous now, change. Charles took his place at the head of the table, but did not sit. Thank you for your patience, he said. We identified material issues in the acquisition package before execution. No funds moved. No signatures were completed. Murmurs rose, then faded. A man from Boston in a navy suit leaned forward. Who identified them? Charles did not hesitate. Miss Grace Bennett. Every eye moved to her. Grace stood near the side of the room, still in housekeeping uniform, practical shoes on premium carpet, a pen in one hand. The contrast was so sharp it almost looked staged. It was not. A woman representing a pension consortium narrowed her eyes. Your facility staff reviewed our merger documents. The question carried disbelief dressed as professionalism. Grace answered calmly. No, ma'am. I recognized altered language because I drafted the original protective provisions. Silence followed, but this time it was not dismissive. It was evaluative. Charles gestured toward the main screen. Please continue. Grace stepped to the front. The analyst beside the monitor moved aside instinctively. She placed the red legal pad on the podium and clicked to the first slide. Two clauses appeared side by side. Original and revised. Black text against white background. Version 1 protected trust participants from transferred liabilities, she said. Version 2 shifts exposure proportionally to affiliated retirement vehicles. She looked around the room. That means pension holders. The woman from the consortium sat straighter. A man from Dallas frowned deeply. Another investor whispered to his counsel. Grace clicked again. Environmental reserve estimates. Debt triggers. Hidden fee escalators. Every issue was precise, measured, undeniable. No drama. Just facts lined up like daylight. 10 minutes in, skepticism had nowhere left to stand. 15 minutes in, notebooks were open across the table. 20 minutes in, one investor asked the question no one had expected to ask that morning. Miss Bennett, what would you do if this were your capital? Grace paused only long enough to respect the seriousness of it. I would pause 48 hours, require refreshed disclosures, ring-fence pension exposure, and reopen pricing from a stronger position. The man nodded slowly. That is exactly what I would do. Across the table, another voice cut in. Then why is she wearing a housekeeping badge instead of sitting in legal? It was not hostile. It was worse for the old order. It was honest. Charles answered before Grace could. Because leadership missed what it should have seen. No one challenged him. At the back of the room, the door opened quietly. Richard Whitmore entered with the careful confidence of a man trying to reinsert himself into history. He carried a slim folder and an expression polished for recovery. Ladies and gentlemen, he said smoothly, before assumptions harden, I would like to clarify a procedural misunderstanding. Several investors looked annoyed rather than relieved. Charles did not invite him forward. Richard continued anyway. Miss Bennett's early draft notes were administrative support. My office transformed raw concepts into executable structure. Grace remained still. The room watched her instead of him. Richard mistook that for opportunity. This is not personal. High-level transactions require seasoned judgment. Passion is admirable, but expertise matters. The pension representative closed her notebook with a quiet snap. Then explain Clause 17, she said. Richard smiled thinly. Risk distribution. To retirees? She asked. He opened his folder, buying time with paper. In certain contingencies. Grace spoke for the first time since he entered. There was no contingency trigger in your language. Richard turned sharply. You are oversimplifying. No, she said. I am removing fog. A few investors smiled despite themselves. Richard's collar seemed suddenly tighter. He moved to the screen and clicked ahead, trying to seize the room physically if not intellectually. The next slide appeared unexpectedly. Authorship logs, revision times, tracked edits under his user credentials. He froze for half a second. The analyst near the laptop looked horrified. Charles's voice was flat. I asked them to leave that slide in. The room changed temperature. Richard recovered poorly. Everyone revises documents. Grace answered softly. Not everyone hides the changes. The Dallas investor leaned back and folded his arms. My fund does not do business with people who mistake access for talent. Another added, nor do we. The pension representative turned to Charles. If Miss Bennett is leading remediation, we stay at the table. If he is involved, we walk. Richard looked around for allies and found only expensive silence. Charles stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore is no longer engaged by Harrington Capital. He then turned to Grace. Miss Bennett, will you lead the corrective review team for the next 48 hours? The room waited. Grace glanced at the housekeeping badge clipped to her chest, then unclipped it slowly and set it on the table beside a crystal water glass. The sound was tiny and unforgettable. Yes, she said. Investors who had doubted her less than an hour ago now nodded with visible relief. Richard stared at the badge as if something larger than employment had just ended. Grace picked up the red legal pad and moved to the head screen. Then let us begin with page 1. And for the first time that day, every person in the room was ready to listen. By noon, the urgency had changed shape. It was no longer panic. It was work. Conference 1, once arranged for polished presentations and carefully managed optimism, had become a war room of spreadsheets, legal drafts, and open laptops glowing under steady white light. Coffee cups multiplied across the table. Jackets were draped over chair backs. Voices stayed low, focused, practical. Grace Bennet stood near the center screen with a marker in one hand and 3 pages of handwritten notes in the other. She had not raised her voice once all morning, yet every conversation bent toward her when she spoke. "Move the indemnity cap to cellar escrow," she said. "Separate pension exposure entirely. Require updated environmental reserves certified by an outside auditor." Pens moved. Heads nodded. The general counsel rewrote language as fast as his pride would allow. Charles Harrington watched from the end of the table, saying less than anyone expected and noticing more than anyone realized. He noticed that Grace never used jargon to impress. She used clarity to solve. He noticed she thanked assistants by name. He noticed that when 2 analysts disagreed, she asked the quieter one to finish first. Competence was one thing. Character under pressure was another. Around 1 o'clock, lunch arrived on silver carts from the executive dining floor. Sandwiches on rye, salads, sparkling water, fruit trays arranged with geometric precision. No one reached for anything immediately. Grace stepped aside to let others eat first out of habit older than the room. Charles saw it. "Miss Bennet," he said, "you are not serving lunch today." Several people glanced up. Grace paused. Charles pulled out the chair beside him. "Please." A small silence followed. It was not dramatic. It was deeper than that. Grace crossed the carpet and took the seat beside the chairman of Harrington Capital. The same investors who had questioned her credentials 2 hours earlier now slid the mustard, napkins, and water her way without being asked. She thanked each of them calmly. Richard Whitmore was nowhere near the room now. His name had become something spoken in hallways with lowered voices and tightened mouths. But absence did not erase impact. Every time someone found another hidden fee or distorted clause, they found one more fingerprint of the culture that had let him thrive. After lunch, Grace returned to the screen. "There is one more issue," she said. The room quieted instantly. She displayed a side agreement tucked into supplemental schedules. Management bonuses tied to accelerated closing dates. Numbers in 7 figures. "This explains the rush," Charles said, voice flat. The general counsel looked genuinely unsettled. "We almost signed under incentive pressure." Grace nodded once. Pressure often arrives dressed as efficiency. Charles leaned back slowly and studied her profile against the light from the windows. For years he had hired confidence because confidence looked expensive. Today he was learning the price of that mistake. By 3 o'clock, revised documents were ready for circulation. Investors reviewed cleaner terms, safer structures, honest disclosures. The atmosphere shifted from damage control to cautious respect. The pension representative from earlier closed her binder and looked directly at Grace. "My members are school custodians, transit workers, retired nurses. You protected people you have never met." Grace answered simply, "Someone should." The woman held her gaze for a moment, then nodded with visible emotion. "Thank you." It was the first thank you Grace had received in rooms like this that sounded complete. Later, while printers hummed outside and teams prepared signature packets for a delayed close, Charles asked Grace to walk with him. They moved down a quiet corridor lined with framed expansion photos and charitable awards. Through a glass wall, Manhattan shimmered in late afternoon gold. "Do you know what my father used to say?" Charles asked. Grace smiled faintly. "You mention him when something matters." Charles almost laughed. He said the easiest way to tell who a person is to watch how they treat the one who cannot help them. They stopped near the window. "I failed that test this morning." Grace considered him carefully. "You corrected it this afternoon." "Too late for some things." "Not for all things." Her answer landed softly and stayed there. Charles looked out over the city. Human resources can offer back pay adjustments, consulting review, formal apologies. Lawyers love forms of repair. Grace stood beside him, hands folded loosely. Some repairs are paper. Some are practice. He turned toward her. What would practice look like? She did not answer quickly. Stop hiring certainty over substance. Stop confusing polish with value. Stop asking people to prove twice what others get assumed once. Charles nodded slowly, each sentence finding its mark. In Conference 1, laughter rose unexpectedly from analysts who had survived the day together. It sounded human after hours of tension. The sun lowered another inch. Buildings across the avenue glowed copper at their edges. Charles spoke without ceremony. "When this closes properly, I want you to consider staying." Grace looked at him, then at the skyline she had spent 18 months polishing from the outside. In housekeeping? She asked lightly. No, he said. Where decisions are made. She did not smile widely. She did not gasp. She simply breathed in once, as if allowing herself to imagine air at a different altitude. Before she could answer, Charles's assistant approached quickly with a folder in hand and concern on her face. Sir, she said, you need to see this immediately. Charles opened the folder. His expression hardened at once. He looked at Grace, then back at the page. It seems, he said quietly, Richard Whitmore was not working alone. The folder in Charles Harrington's hand was thin, but the weight of it changed the hallway. The late afternoon warmth from the windows suddenly felt colder. Grace Bennett watched his expression tighten as he scanned the first page, then the second. He handed the folder to her without a word. Inside were internal email summaries, approval logs, and payment authorizations connected to the acquisition review. Richard Whitmore had altered clauses, yes, but several edits had been approved from inside Harrington Capital itself. One name appeared more than the others. Daniel Mercer, Chief Financial Officer. Grace looked up slowly. He signed off on the accelerated close incentives. Charles nodded once. And the reserve assumptions. The skyline beyond the glass remained golden and calm, indifferent to what men did in towers. Inside, the day sharpened again. Daniel Mercer had worked beside Charles for 11 years. He was disciplined, polished, trusted by boards and bankers alike. He also controlled internal financial reporting. If he had coordinated with Whitmore, then this had never been one man's arrogance. It had been architecture. Where is he? Grace asked. Charles checked his watch. Preparing the investor close call in conference 2. They moved quickly but without visible panic, the way experienced people move when stakes are high enough to require quiet. Conference 2 was smaller, lined with monitors displaying market feeds and closing schedules. Daniel Mercer stood at the far table reviewing notes with 2 treasury managers when Charles entered. Tall, silver-haired, perfectly measured, Daniel looked up with mild surprise that became concern when he saw Grace beside him holding the folder. Charles, he said smoothly, we are 5 minutes from the lender call. Charles closed the door behind them. Cancel it. Daniel's smile held for half a second too long. That would send the wrong signal. The wrong signal, Charles replied, was sent when my own chief financial officer approved hidden liabilities. The treasury managers froze. Daniel's eyes flicked to them. Leave us. They left immediately, taking their confusion with them. Silence settled after the latch clicked shut. Daniel loosened neither tie nor posture. You are making a serious accusation based on partial documents. Grace placed the folder on the table and opened it to the approval chain. You initialed revised reserves at 6:42 a.m. yesterday. She turned another page. You approved accelerated bonuses tied to same-day execution. Another page. And you requested pension exposure language remained below summary threshold. Daniel looked at her, as one might look at a fire appearing where there should be none. Who exactly are you? Grace met his gaze calmly. Someone who reads before signing. Charles almost smiled despite the moment. Daniel changed tactics. Charles, think carefully. Markets punish uncertainty. We push timing because delays cost millions. By risking retirees? Grace asked. Daniel spread his hands. Risk is never personal in transactions this size. The sentence hung in the room like something rotten finally uncovered. Charles stared at the man he had trusted for over a decade. It is always personal to the people carrying it. Daniel's tone cooled. You built this company to win. Do not pretend otherwise. Charles stepped closer to the table. I built it to grow. Men like you redefine growth after the fact. Daniel glanced toward the folder again, calculating. If this goes public, lenders panic, investors question controls, ratings agencies circle. You need me to stabilize the narrative. Grace answered before Charles could. Truth stabilizes faster than spin. Daniel's jaw tightened for the first time all day. He looked at Grace's uniform, then back to Charles. You are trusting a facilities worker over your CFO? Charles's response came instantly. Today I am trusting the only person who protected people with nothing to gain. The room went still. Daniel recognized then what Richard had learned too late. Status was no longer currency here. Evidence was. He tried one last appeal, softer now. Charles, 11 years. We have weathered recessions together. And perhaps I never asked who was steering in calm water. Charles pressed the intercom beside the monitor wall. Security and internal audit to conference 2. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. You cannot do this based on optics. No, Charles said. I am doing it based on documents, judgment, and the sentence you just spoke about. Risk not being personal. Minutes later, internal audit arrived with tablets and controlled faces. Security remained discreetly near the door. Charles instructed immediate preservation of devices, access suspension, and review of all acquisition communications. Daniel did not argue further. Pride had given way to arithmetic. He collected nothing from the table because nothing on it belonged to him anymore. As he reached the door, he turned once toward Grace. Enjoy the spotlight. Rooms like this move on quickly. Grace answered in the same steady voice that had changed the day. Maybe, but clauses stay in writing. Even one auditor smiled before hiding it. Daniel left. The corridor beyond buzzed with the strange electricity that follows a powerful fall. Charles remained facing the closed door for several seconds, then exhaled slowly. Some betrayals make noise. Others arrive dressed as competence for years. He turned to Grace. You could have walked away after this morning. I know. Why did you stay? She looked through the glass wall toward Conference 1, where revised documents waited and investors checked watches and pensions depended on honesty they would never witness. Because the people affected by bad decisions are rarely in the room, she said. Someone should be. Charles nodded once, deeply. Then he straightened, the weight of disappointment settling into purpose. Come with me, he said. There is one more room that needs to hear you. As they stepped into the corridor, staff parted instinctively. Not for the chairman this time, but for the woman walking beside him. Conference 1 had changed again by late afternoon. What began as a room of caution was now a room waiting for resolution. Revised contracts sat neatly stacked at each seat. Screens displayed updated figures, corrected disclosures, and clean liability structures. Outside the windows, the sky over Manhattan had turned amber, then rose, then the first hints of evening blue. Inside, every person seemed aware they were about to remember this day for a long time. Charles Harrington entered with Grace Bennett beside him. Conversations stopped at once. Some investors had already heard. Whispers about Daniel Mercer being removed from access systems. Others only saw Charles's expression and understood enough. He stood at the head of the table, but did not open with numbers.